All right. So to understand bullwhips and to understand whips in general, you have to imagine a different time than the time we live in now. Now, being up here in Squaw Valley, I know we have a very savvy audience here that's used to cattle and cows and cowboys and all that type of things. A lot of people aren't as familiar with that, but you have to imagine a time before the internal combustion engine, before there was cars going around, before you have cars and trucks and all that type of thing, a time when the only source of power that people had was either their own muscles or the muscles of animals. And so the way that things would get done is if you have a load to move, you move them on with the cattle pulling them, or with oxes or horses and so on. And so in that time period, whips were used in order to help control animals. There was different types of whips for different applications, because if you're on horseback, you might want a longer whip, or if you're riding coach, you need a whip with a long handle, and so on and so forth. But the bullwhip or droving whips, different types of cattle whips, are the most powerful and usually the biggest of the whips. So they've continued today to become a hobby and something that you see in movies as a skill. People like Zorro or Indiana Jones and so on. But thinking about this time, you can understand with seeing the whip how it relates to animals and controlling them. A whip is something that's known as it's flash. It has presence. It can strike out at distance, travel faster than a bullet. It makes a loud noise when it reaches out to the end of its length, and so animals respect that. But instead of talking about it, I'll go ahead and show you here. Now, with a whip, a cowboy would be able to herd 3 times as much cattle as someone who didn't have a whip. It gives them so much more control. And so I'm sure you'll be able to see once I demonstrate this why he has that kind of power and that presence with the whip. Now, in Cold Country, speaking of another book, if anyone's ever read Laura Ingalls Wilder, she has a book that she wrote called Farmer Boy, and it's about the life of her husband growing up, Almanza Wilder. And it talks about his father in that, and how he would oil his whip at night, to keep it preserved during the wet weather and the cold weather. And the cattle that Mr. Wilder had, it was so cold out there that they could fall asleep, and they would actually freeze to death in that country. And so he would go out in the middle of the night with his whip, and he would crack it just to wake the cattle up. So there's many uses for whips back in back in cowboy days. And so in order to do that, a whip would have to be very loud, right? So I want everybody to just be aware of that fact, and you might want to cover your ears, or just at least until you get used to it, and then you can feel where you're at with it, and leave your ears uncovered. But just to start off, that's what you need to do, just to be safe, on the safe side, especially for little babies or children. All right, so let's go through this. Now you can see, you kind of get used to that and get an idea of what it does. Okay. Now I'm sure you can see why that would wake the cows up. I'm sure you can also see why that gives a cowboy control to be able to move cattle. He could use multiple skills to be able to do that, and we'll kind of cover some of that. But what made that noise? Does anybody have any idea?
Breaks the sound barrier.
Yep, you're right. The string on the end, in fact, let me show you this whip. This is an American pattern bullwhip. It's got a handle right here called the foundation, like a wrist strap, which you could use for various purposes. It's braided out of kangaroo leather, and it's got 12 strands right here. It's called 12 plait. And this is the type of bullwhip I make most commonly, and I sell them around the world. This is called the belly, the heavier part of the whip, and then it gets thinner as it goes out. This is called the point. And then you have a hitch right here, and then this portion right here is called the fall. This is made out of cowhide, and it's thicker and tough, and you can replace it. On the end here you have a cracker, which is in this case is a nylon string. On this whip I have a poly string, and this is the portion that actually breaks the sound barrier. The sound barrier is about 770 miles an hour, so it's quite fast. But basically what works with a whip that allows it to break the sound barrier is something in physics called conservation of momentum. That's something you also read about in books if you ever study physics or in high school or whatever. And what you're dealing with is the fact that this whip has several properties that allow it to do that. It has weight, first of all, and density. It's not made out of feathers, it's very heavy. This weighs about 2 pounds, and then it gets to where it's very thin at the end. And in physics, momentum is velocity times, momentum is velocity times mass. So as the mass of this whip becomes less and a wave rolls out, it accelerates. And so I'm able to throw a wave down the whip and it accelerates eventually to where it breaks the sound barrier. So that is what's actually working there. Now, with Cowboys, they would do several different techniques. The reason it's called a bullwhip is because in America they're mostly used to deal with bulls. If you were herding cattle, then the bulls might get really upset with you messing with their ladies and their children, and so you would have to distract the bull with the whip, or else just dealing with bulls in general, you need a whip because they're very honoring. One of the techniques that the Cowboys would use that made the whip use of the whip a little bit more effective and easier for them to use would be a technique called the cow and the calf. And the cow and the calf, you do one crack more solid up top and then a little bit lighter crack underneath. And that's why it got the name. But they could be on horseback and they could easily do this technique. And it goes like this. So it's just double like that. And you can just do that pretty continuously until you're blue in the face if you want. And that's what's neat. It's called multiple cracking. Now, Cowboys use very few tools extensively, and they were out on the trail for long periods of time, so they spent a lot of time with their whips, and they could develop considerable skill. And so that's where they would learn to do techniques such as the cow and the calf and other techniques. So I'll show you a few different techniques that they might be able to do with an American bullwhip like this. Oh, that's good with my left hand. All right. You get the idea of what they could do, and they would be on horseback, and they get the cattle, the cattle would respond to the crack of the whip. Another thing that they were able to use to control cattle would also be echoes. And I don't know if we have a great place to do that, but you could actually, in a place like this with all these hills, you can echo the crack off another hill, and the cattle will go, oh, okay. So it has a lot of uses. I don't know if we can kind of see different places. Here it goes. So if the speed of sound is about 770 miles an hour, that's the speed that it's actually traveling at. And a shockwave or a sonic boom is involved when the cracker moves faster than the speed sound can travel at. And at that point, it hits the air molecules. Yes? Oh, that is the water that is picking up on the grass. So, see it right there. Right. Right. So anybody have any other questions? I'm going to go on here, but yes. All right. Well, let me also talk. We'll also talk about those who made whips. Back prior to World War II. World War II is when whipmaking declined significantly. You start to get all these automobiles, and animal power was no longer necessary. Back before that time, there in Chicago and San Francisco, there was the Diamond Whip Company and Buckheimer, and then there was a bunch of assorted individuals that made whip all out in the West. And it was a real industrialized thing. They actually had braiding machines, and they made good bullwhips. They made them out of cowhide with buckskin points. They looked somewhat similar to this. This actually has quite a bit of Australian influence in the design. This design was started by the guy who wrote the book that I I learned whipmaking from, is David Morgan. And he's in his 80s now, he lives up in Washington. And this is the design that was also used in the Indiana Jones movies. But down in the same time in history, you have the American Cowboy, and they're using their American bullwhips like this. You also have the Australian Stockman down below the equator, and they were the same type of thing. They were cowboys. They used the whip more extensively than was used in the Wild West up here in America. The conditions, the economic and political conditions, and just the society was a little bit different. And they developed whips to the highest refinement of anywhere in the world. Part of the reason that occurred was also the materials that they were using. They would have a 5-year apprenticeship program, not really a program, but they would have individual craftsmen that were all constantly competing against each other, and there was a variety of them. And I'll show you some of the materials and some of what they learned. They discovered down in Australia that kangaroo leather was the nicest leather for braiding that anyone had ever seen. It's very thin, but it's very strong, and it tans up to be able to be cut into very fine strips, like you see here. You can probably barely even see the strands, and braids them very well. This allowed them to make their whips extremely dense, and then they worked through. The competition that all the individual whip makers had with each other meant the whip just developed very quickly into a very skilled tool. Another thing that these whip makers discovered was something called the plaited belly. This is a cross section of a whip. As you can see, it's leather all the way through. This is an Australian style. In the very core, I just have a few little strips of leather, and then I have a braid. And that's basically composed of kangaroo leather. It's cut into strips and then braided in 4 strands. And that's called the belly. Then, in this case, this is a double-bellied whip. I have, in this case, 8 strands right here, and I braid right over the top of that, and you can see it's starting to get thicker. Then a strip of leather is placed over that, which is called the bolster. And it provides you a smooth surface in which you can plait the overlay. Now, I'm using this term plaiting. Plaiting is a term for round braiding over a core, and so that's why it's called plaiting. If you look at this, why is a whip braided? It overlaps, and it actually allows it to be flexible and thick and strong. And then when you get to the end here, you have layers. I want to see. I'll walk back and forth here. See how it's flexible. Different layers here.
Every layer isn't braided though, just the outer layer?
No, see, look, it's the core is just strips, and that's a braid, and that's a braid, then this is a strip, and then I got a braid on top. So this is 3 braids thick. At that time in history, I didn't go this way. I'm sorry, guys. At that time in history, we can have people can come up and look at the end. That'll be fine. At that time in history, whipmaking developed to such a high refinement, like I said, that the individual whipmakers became famous. Names like Henderson and Scobie, King, Scott, Hassett, and so on were producing such high-level work that they were famous even worldwide. Cecil Henderson's bullwhips and stock whips were imported to the United States, used by people like Will Rogers. Douglas Fairbanks Sr. would use them in his movies as well, and so they were really a high level of work. But I will show you an Australian bullwhip here, just to give you an idea of the difference between that and an American bullwhip. And like I said, there's a worldwide influence. We'll start over here, since I left these people out earlier.
How long does it take you to make a?
This whip right here has about 40 hours of work in it. This is worth about $900. And it's two-tone. As you can see, the fancy braiding on the handle is done. This took a day. Literally, it took a day in order to do that, for me anyway. If I got better, maybe it'd take me less time. But it looks good, so that's what counts, right? Anyway, so they started to produce really high-level work like this. They would put people's initials on the side, which I've also done. And it takes some time to do it. Yeah. So I take these patterns and I graph them out so that I can in advance decide what I'm going to do. Let's see. Now this whip is 24 strands of kangaroo leather. They're cut very finely. In fact, they taper. At the point, there's 8 strands, actually 7. Sorry, I'm looking at my own work. And at the bottom here, see the handle. On the end, I didn't describe it earlier, but this knob here is called a Turk's head, and it's a form of knot. And what it does is it starts and ends at the same place. It's a mathematically perfect little knot. It's really neat. They're fun to tie. Yes, I do. I cut them out of the hides. The whip makers would have, a lot of times they would have their thumbnail a little longer so that they could help guide their blade when they're cutting. It's got energy traveling through it. Well balanced. Well, the Australian whips are more agile than the American whips. I was showing you about that potted belly. What the Australian whip makers would say is that a whip is like a man, no guts, no good. And so that belly, which it makes it dense, and that density allows it to really cut through the air and overcome the friction that it's dealing with in order to be able to crack and to have the power that it needs to have. Now, what I'm going to show you is the agility of the Australian whip, and I'm going to do that with a technique called the Queensland Flash. Now, the Queensland Flash was a technique that came out of Queensland, Australia. It's a province of Australia, and the stockmen in Australia would use this as a tail to tell the city lads. It wasn't really true what they were telling them, but it looked impressive, and so it came to become very famous. And they basically said, you know, if you're herding cattle, you got your whip and you want to get that cow going off in front of you, but then you want to get your horse going and falling behind, and then you want to really get that cow going off a little faster. So you start with a crack in the front, then you go with one in the back, and then a big strong one in the front. So it goes like this. That's the Queensland Flash. It's fast, huh? Now this whip's about 11 feet long, so between cracks it has to travel 22 feet, plus the length of my arm, so it is moving quite fast, and then the end breaks the sound barrier. But I'll do that again in a different angle here. You can also spice that up with the flourish, which makes it a little better. I don't know what that's called, but it's Queensland Flash with a flourish. Anyway, that's fun. That's a lot of fun to use these whips. They're very athletic. So, as you notice, that technique was called after a province. Some techniques are called after the name of certain men who invented them. Different areas, you got techniques that are descriptive and so on. But this made not just the whip makers themselves famous for their work, but also the whip crackers who would invent different techniques, because it's just waiting for us to discover. In fact, there's been techniques that have been invented within the last 50 years, and different routines where people have figured out ways that you can make a whip crack. You know, Ben's helicopter or Hassett's four corners, or different techniques. But back in the day, whips were also used in the circus as the skill was really developed among cowboys, and they stood out or whatever. Maybe they could have a career in the circus instead of just moving cattle. And different techniques like the four corners was brought into the circus and were very famous at that time. I'll go ahead and show you the four corners. It involves the whip cracking 4 times in a circle without crossing the middle. It goes like this. Different angle here. Thank you. Now, I think you kind of got an idea of some of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to show you something different here in a second so that it's a little bit more visual. But before I do that, I'll show you a few other techniques kind of based off the four corners. We'll show you, I'm going to show you a flag so that you can see what it's actually doing. It's moving so fast that you're not really able to see it. So let me get a flag here. Yeah. Australia,
you would dare run.
competitions. Those whipcrackers use two hands. Believe it or not, I'm actually not that great a whipcracker. If I was good, I could do two hands, double hasses, four corners, crack behind my back, so on and so forth. But I'm a mess. I'm a whip maker, not a whip cracker. But I do enjoy working with one hand, and I can change hands some. But there are many who are much better than me. So this is going to make this more visual. So now you don't have to worry about your ears so much as well. Four corners. Ta-da! Another technique, Ian Westbrook is an old circus performer from a long time ago, and he developed a technique called the butterfly. Actually, I'm not sure if he developed it. It was just something that I know he did and wasn't used very commonly. Well, that's fun. All right. This also gives you a chance to see the action, see how it accelerates. And the flag slows it down quite a bit. There's another Australian bull whip I made, same pattern as the last one. This one's 20 plat. When we talk about plat and the different plat, like the first whip I showed you was 12 plat. The finer the plat, usually the better quality the whip is considered, because it allows the whip to be slightly more dense, slightly more flexible, more easily flexible, and so it reduces internal friction and friction in terms of air friction as you're moving through the air. But I'm sure you can see from the flag that the whip, as it cracks, rolls out in a loop, and at the velocity that it's going, it can cut through things. Now, I've seen some performers who can cut a cigarette out of somebody's mouth. My lovely assistant Carol, who's also my sister, does not smoke. Sorry. Now, I've actually also seen a performer cut a cigarette out of his own mouth, and that amazed me. I don't smoke either, so we're not going to go there. Okay? Like I said, I'm more of a whip maker than a whip cracker, but I can pop some balloons, and that'll be good and safe for the library.
Yeah. That's right, it's an orange balloon, you're right.
All right, ready? Yep. See if you can get them out of the wind. Why we will try.
How about different direction, Ben?
If I hit that pole before I hit that balloon, it ain't gonna pop. I'm just telling you. I'll go for it, and if I miss, don't laugh. All right. Oh, not good.
A little bigger than a cigarette.
A little bigger than a cigarette, exactly. Like I said, I make whips. I don't perform very often.
Oh wow. That was half filled up and
Now,
half.
if you would care to have a cigarette, I will put it out of your mouth for you.
Not me.
You have to sign a contract first. A lot of times when performers will cut like a cigarette, they'll be doing it at a little lower speed, something more like that, to be safe, and to be somewhat safe anyway.
10-foot cigarette.
Yeah. Last performance we cut targets out of our hands, and I like the balloons. Another thing that a whip's famous for, in fact, Indiana Jones made the whip famous for its ability to grab and wrap things. That's my son's favorite thing to do at 3 years old because he can't really crack it yet. But it's something that you can do, and you could apply force to the target and actually hit the target hard, or you could do it and be gentle by cracking the whip past the target, and then it wraps around. And that's another reason that I have my lovely assistant here, so I can wrap her weight.
Okay, this is
Believe it or not, I actually did this at my wedding. This is my lovely wife right here.
She doesn't want to get married again.
Yeah, she met me halfway down the aisle. She threw the bouquet. I wrapped her waist, and then we went up to the altar.
hold me the rest of the way down.
All right.
You pulled her in, yeah.
Ooh, didn't really catch. All right, let's try it again. There we go. This is good. All right. Well, that's about what I have. About 30 minutes there. But I definitely have a lot more I could say, and definitely take any questions anybody has. Do some more whip cracking, or we could do whatever people want. Yes.
What kind of oil do you use on the whip?
Okay. I use mostly lard, actually. There's a leather dressing called Pecker's leather dressing. It's really good, and I usually mix a little bit of that in. But I found that there's no problem with lard. When you braid a whip, you're supposed to use something called plaiting soap, and it's usually a mixture of soap and fat, so that the strands slide into place very easily. Because when you're doing the braiding, you pull very, very hard. It's a very physical job in order to get it so hard and thick. And so that really, it's actually got quite a bit of grease in here, or fat. You can't feel it, but it's in here. It gives the leather a lot of weight. And then when you're in rainy weather like this, it's fine because it's already got the fat in it. Leather, when it gets dry, will crack. It's not good for it. Any other questions?
Did you ever do classes?
I've taught people a few things, but I haven't ever done classes before. But I mean, I could. It's just, I guess the biggest cost would be materials. A finger hide like that costs about $130 or so.
And how many whips would that make it?
That would make almost one. That would do the overlay plus a little extra, and so I would have to use another hide for the middle.
How long does it take to make them?
Okay, like these take about, like this takes about 20 hours of work, and I have about $120 materials. This sells for around $450, and the whips take a lot longer, about twice that long. They sell for about twice that much too. So, you can see the Turk's head knot right here is really neat. It's a sailor's knot is what this is. And back in the day, the sailors would have a lot of time on their hands, just like I said, the cowboys do, when they learn and they practice. Well, they had rope. And so the sailors would tie the rope, and they would tie it on the mast, and tie it all over the place, and they would figure out these knots. And there's many, many of them, and there's some that are very complex.
As a weapon.
What's that?
As a weapon. Are you familiar with the weapon history of a whip too? Or?
I'm not really familiar. I know there's some kind of Filipino history.
Short whips, right?
Yeah, they were shorter whips. There's Mongolian history to whips, and then there's more of a European history. And the Mongolian whips weren't tapered as well. But I'm not really familiar with the Filipino whips as weapons. As a weapon, I think it's more. It will hurt somebody, and it's intimidating. It would cut flesh if it hit. It could maybe break somebody's hand, but it's not lethal. But it definitely would be intimidating. It's great for disarms, like Indiana Jones. You know, if somebody has a gun or a knife, you can take it out of there. In the book I read back when I started, he said that with a man with a stock whip versus a man with a gun, if they were equally skilled, that the stock whip could actually disarm the gun before he'd be able to shoot him. I don't know when they did that experiment, but it definitely would be maybe in the Wild West, right? It definitely would be a close show. It's very fast. You know, if I get this out, I'm not as quick as the stock whip, but whip can just come in straight or whatever. Start with the whip in front. It's pretty fast. I don't think this might be as fast as the quickest quick draw artist, but it's pretty fast. And that would, if that hit somebody's arm, it would just send the gun flying. But any other questions?
Was the leather continuous, or do you have to connect it? Can it go straight?
Good question. Let me grab the hide. Here's some stuff I use. That's a great question. If you're readying a whip, this whip is measured 8 foot from this end down to the point. By American measure, it's 11 feet because they count the fall in America. But the strands for a whip like this are about 14 feet. And so exactly how are you going to get a 14-foot strand out of a hide like this? The Eskimos would use seal hide for their whips. And they would actually, when they killed the seal, they would actually somehow get it out and then actually have a tube, and they would cut around the tube. In the case of kangaroo leather like this, this is just the back on the kangaroos have a pouch in the front. Kangaroos are quite big, most people realize. And what you do with a hide like this, you start by trimming it. And I'll trim off, and I'll look for any scars that are going to be detrimental to what I'm doing. Kangaroos fight quite a bit. They get really rough and tumble. There's a scar that goes quite through it. But I'll trim that, and then I cut strands from around the perimeter. And it goes in, and so the hide becomes smaller as I do it. And I start with hide like this, like that one's done, so getting all the leather out of it. And scars as I go. It's not quite straight, but the leather stretches through. So, yeah, what I'll do is then I'll take it, and I'll soak it in water, and I'll pull it. And I test it and make sure it won't break. It's very strong. And then I'll come back and I'll cut a second time and get it to the exact taper that I use. These whips all start off with the strands being wider and then narrower. And then as you make it, so you start with 24 strands and I end with 7, so I drop strands into the core as I go. And then that way I fit the core to the overlay in order to be very firm and hits. If anyone wants to come up afterwards and feel this,
If you damage the fall, can that be repaired?
it sure can. And you know, these usually, unless you're, you know, chopping tree branches or something, these usually will last for a year or two, and then you have to replace it. It's very easy. You just put a new one on, you cut this one off, pull it out, and fill one in, or the new one in. Frequently have to change the crackers. Sonic booms are not easy on string. So I also brought, if you're very wet, companies that I work with, this is a photocopy of one of the charts I use. A lot of whip makers are very skilled at just getting this all together. They say it's like cutting a suit of clothes for an adult when you just only have the kid to look at. Because when you get the belly of the whip and it's braided, platted, it's small, and then you have to say, okay, how am I going to make the finished product? How do I get the layers here to have the finished product? You start with that. You develop a lot of skill with that. I don't make as many whips as they made back in the day, but I work with charts, and I have the length down here, and I have the diameter right here. And this is what the actual taper of the full whip will look like on paper in terms of 3 foot long, it's going to be that diameter, and so on. And I really work with this because in order to make a whip that cracks as well as these Australian whips do, especially, you need a very well balanced whip. Not any whip can do that. It will not feel right, it won't be able to make it work. So then it goes down, and I have the bellies and the ear diameter and so on. I also photocopied an explanation of plaiting, so you can kind of see the way the strands go. I don't know, it's not going to do all that much, but you can kind of see. You have the strand plate off the side, you have the belly in your hand, pull around, and so on and so forth. I also photocopied some of my own work with just work I was doing designing whip handles. This is actually from this whip, you see, but it shows both sides on the same side. And by doing that, I'm able to do the design before I actually go into doing the work itself. Since it takes so much time, you don't want to mess it up. And you guys did get to see this earlier. Here it is. See, it's all a little bit through. And it's flexible. That's what happens when you chop through it. Or the,
It's like a hard to part with the whip after you make it. It's like a work of art.
It is.
He is the whip artist.
The money helps. The money helps. The other good thing is that you know,
your part, right?
By doing that.
Her part.
Well, it sounds like the next event is inside and ready to go. Thank you. So,
Give everybody give him a hand. How many of you like to grow up with him being your dad? You know how far you could get away before he got you?
No, 10 feet.
That hurt when he gets mouthy, wouldn't he?
Grab the whip.